Hello, and we're going to continue chapter 10 on the Greek heroes, specifically the figure of Achilles and the sort of heroes, the sort of warrior heroes that we're talking about in this chapter. And the theoretical lens we're looking at here focuses on a particular character, a guy named Vladimir Prop. So we're going to look at Prop's morphology of the folktale a little bit and what it tells about the hero's story, and then in other people's scheme on how the hero story works. So Vladimir Prop and affiliated lists of heroic adventures which classical scholars have used to study Greek heroes. So we're going to be looking at sort of Raglan's list, variation of it in the next chapter. But here we're going to look at Prop's morphology. So Prop wrote a work called The Morphology of the Russian Folktale. He wrote the work in the late 20s, early 30s. So it's a work done in the Soviet Union. He was a folklorist. He studied folklore. And he decided there was a collection of, or a directory sort of Russian folk tales, and he looked specifically at 100 in that 100 stories to see what similarities they had. And all of those stories were Russian quest stories. So they're all about a hero going in after something, right? He's going on a mission to get something. So that right there doesn't apply to all heroes. Not all heroes are going out to get something. They may get something, but that might not be the purpose, right? You can have like a reluctant hero who doesn't really want whatever reward is, but finds himself sort of stuck on the road and does heroic things. That wouldn't really apply to what Prop was looking at. So he looked at 100 of these stories. He formed types of characters. So these would be the hero, for instance, the donor. So this would be someone who gives the hero some sort. So Captain America is the hero, but Howard Stark, Tony Stark, is the one who creates the shield, which he has, which is his weapon. So that's an important part of Captain America. Howard Stark is not the hero, but he does give an important piece of equipment to the hero. You've got the helper of the hero. You've got the villain. It writes some others, and you can see these in the book. So you just can look at those. He also sort of established there were 31 functions. He used the word function, or the Russian word for function. Sometimes people call these motifs, but these are, some of them are pretty obvious. The hero is born is one. Obviously, if you start a story and the hero is already really an important part of that story, and that function is not there. What he found was that of the 31, they always appear in the same order, but no story has all 31. Okay, now some key ones that you would have. The hero gets the call to adventure, right? So in Star Wars, right, this is when Luke, he's fiddling with R2-D2, and out pops the hologram of Princess Leia saying, "Obi-Wan, please help me. You're my only hope." So that's the call to adventure, right? That sort of gets the adventure started as far as Luke goes. The getting the objects or saving the princess or whatever that might be would be another thing. So, and you can see this. I mean, you could take a movie like Star Wars and go through and motifs are, or any other sort of heroic story, any of the superhero stories. You could look at that and see how that applies. Mission Impossible, which is about missions, and therefore you've got a quest built into the title even. The book sort of indicates how you can take those 31 ideas and see them as part of Van Gennep's three-part division of the initiation rite. So you've got, the separation, which obviously is the part where the hero gets the call and then goes on the mission, right? There's the separation, the actual trial that he has to endure at the end. And actually that setup, Joseph Campbell referred to this as the monomyth and said the pattern is basically the hero leaves, the hero returns. So Here we've got an illustration for the Firebird. There's a famous ballet with music by Igor Stravinsky called The Firebird. I hardly recommend the music, but Stravinsky's score for that is quite beautiful. So here, at any rate, this is a Russian story depicted here. It's from a book illustration. So that's all we're going to do really with that. You can find that information. You can find the 31 functions, types of characters in the chapter when you read it. The comparison here is rather nice because we look at two different heroes. We look at the hero Gilgamesh, who comes from the city of Uruk in Sumer, which is right there in modern-day Iraq, right down here. And we also have Aeneas, who will eventually settle in Italy, and his settlement in Italy will eventually found Rome. So he's a Trojan hero who travels from Troy, goes all around the Greek world, and ends up in Italy. He won't eventually, but one of his descendants will found Rome. His life, his anger, the tension between anger and sorrow, and the brevity of life also define the story of Gilgamesh. Sort of. The story of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is a powerful king, and he basically acts like a tyrant. He's terrible to his people. He pushes them way too hard. He basically, women that he wants, whether they're married. I mean, he's really tough. I mean, the people basically pray for some intervention, and the gods create a wild man named Enkidu, who then becomes first Gilgamesh, but then they become best friends and they have adventures. When Enkidu dies, and he dies horribly, he gets like a wasting disease, and he sort of wastes away. So it's a really it's not a heroic sort of death. Gilgamesh is so horrified by that he can find the secret to immortality, because he doesn't want to go through that. So there's a little more fear. I mean, Gilgamesh basically is cool about dying. He's not backing off. He doesn't really care after that, but he's okay with that. The story of the Roman hero in sorrow and anger, sort of. So Aeneas is the story of the Aeneid is the story of Aeneas, and he travels ultimately to Italy to found a new home after Troy is destroyed. He shows anger in Book 2, which deals with the fall of Troy, some heroic anger. Give it up because he has to save his father, his family, right? He has to go found this new settlement. If Troy is to survive, it can only survive elsewhere under a new identity. Ultimately, it'll be Rome. And so he's a duty-bound character, and ultimately a sense of duty is what really drives Aeneas. The only other part in the work where we get real anger from Aeneas, Book 12. He is fighting against Turnus, an Italian warrior, and he happens to see this token of one of his comrades whom he had sworn to protect. The comrade he's already given a funeral to in Book 11, and he's upset when he sees this token. Like, anger takes over. His eyes go red. He just, he's totally merciless. And the poem ends at that point, which is very surprising because Aeneas is a much more controlled hero than any of these guys. The story of all three are defined by the epic genre, so there are certain rules in, they're big poems. They deal with something of national importance, all that. Epics are long poems with timelines that span years or decades. The Aeneid certainly does, and so does the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Iliad really deals with about 43 days, I think, of action, and we actually have two-week periods in there where no real action happens. So it's really focusing on settings are grand. They center on wars and quest. Their characters are big and heroic and strong and all that stuff. So the Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of a Sumerian king who ruled around 2800 BCE. The poem itself is much later. It's in an Akkadian, Akkadian language, and Akkadia took over Sumer. So we have basically the Akkadian version of the story, but it's still older than the Iliad or the Odyssey, so it does predate those. Did it have any effect on those? I doubt it, because I don't know that there would be that level of knowledge shared. Great king, but he's cruel. He basically does what he wants, and he doesn't really care who he hurts. So the gods create a rival for him, Enkidu. And Enkidu is a natural man. He hangs out with the animals until he meets the temple prostitute of the temple. The two of them basically have sex for a few days, and after he's done having sex with the temple prostitute, he feels a difference, and he goes out to hang out with the animals again. Animals avoid him. So somehow, a weekend or a week of sex with the temple prostitute makes you too cultured to hang out with animals anymore. That appears to be the... He seeks out Gilgamesh. He and Gilgamesh have a draw, and when it's over, Gilgamesh is changed. He now has a best friend, and his anger and his, the things that sort of make him cruel are now outwardly directed at monsters. He and Enkidu are going to go and kick ass on some monsters and make life in Uruk and the surrounding area much better for everyone. So the people get their wish. Gilgamesh stops being Enkidu, go and have these adventures. Enkidu dies. He comes down with some sort of illness. They kill this monster in a pine forest called Humbaba. They're successful, but then Enkidu comes down with some sort of disease, and he basically wastes away. And it's described in like great detail. He wastes away, and then of course the body starts to decay, and there are maggots and worms coming out of the nose hole and so forth. Gilgamesh determined that he's going to find a way to get immortality. And in chapter 12, we'll see the part where he travels to Utnapishtim, the immortal man who survived the flood. The same story that we get with Noah. Utnapishtim survives in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he is made immortal. But what he finds is Utnapishtim has nothing to give him that will make him immortal, and he's basically told the only immortality he can get is if he is a good king, and he is remembered by his people, and he is remembered in song, and he makes Uruk the best city of all, then people will remember him whenever they come to visit Uruk. And that's it. That's immortality you can really count on. And at the end, he's cool with that. He accepts that. The tales of Gilgamesh and Achilles have many similarities, despite the fact that they are seeking opposite goals. Gilgamesh is much more afraid of death than Achilles. This is from the palace around 725 BCE, and at any rate, is a heroic figure who's sort of strangling a lion. So the selections we have from the Epic of Gilgamesh, we get a selection from Tablet 1. The Epic of Gilgamesh survives on clay tablets, and of course, because they're clay tablets, parts have chipped off. So we've got some gaps in the narrative, and we've got some lines where we don't have the whole line. This is represented by square brackets and dots. Whenever there's square brackets and there are words inside, that means that we don't have those words, but because of other passages, scholars are pretty sure that's the word would be there. So they're, every now and then they can fill stuff in, but they're admitting, but we don't actually have them on the clay tablets because that part's chipped. But in Tablet 1, Gilgamesh becomes friends with Enkidu, and the two are setting out to have the heroic adventures. The second selection comes from where Gilgamesh mourns his dead friend Enkidu. Moving on to Aeneas and Virgil's Aeneid. The Roman poet Virgil modeled his Aeneid on Homer's. Now, Virgil's an interesting poet. For one thing, we have everything that Virgil wrote. Virgil wrote 3 poems, or 3 collections of poems, I guess. He wrote a collection called the Eclogues, which means the selections. It's 10 poems. They're bucolic poems, so they're poems about shepherds. That was very popular in Greece in the 3rd century BCE, and he is modeling his poetry on those bucolic poets. He also wrote a work called the Georgics, which means farming poems. This is modeled on Hesiod's Works and Days, but it's inspired by that. So he's basically, first he tries to be like the bucolic poets, then he tries to be like Hesiod, one of the oral poets, and then finally, in his last work, the Aeneid, which is about the hero Aeneas, he is going to take on Homer, both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so it's a 12-chapter, 12-book work, but each book is twice as long as a book in the Iliad or Odyssey, so the length of the Aeneid is the same length as the Iliad or the Odyssey. The first 6 Aeneas' travels, so that's like the Odyssey portion of the poem, and then books 7 through 12 deal with Aeneas fighting a war in Italy so that he can actually stay there and establish a settlement, and that is basically the Iliad portion of the story. Aeneas is a hero of Troy. He is mentioned in the Iliad. He actually is going to fight Achilles in book 20, but Poseidon intervenes and saves him because Aeneas has a destiny after the fall of Troy. And so Poseidon, because he would die in that encounter. Yet the full message is just that he's going to go somewhere to the west. The Romans later then took that and said, well, we're in the west, and we know we're not Greeks, so he must come from the Trojans. So he escapes the destruction of the city with his family. Their journey is defined by the anger of Juno, the Roman goddess equivalent to Hera, again, and she really is quite vicious and vindictive. The poem follows Aeneas' journey to Italy and the establishment of a kingdom. Well, at the end of the poem, he's on the point of doing that. It reflects Virgil's thoughts on the values of the Roman Empire and the government under the rule of Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor and was the ruler at the time that Aeneas is that Virgil is writing. The question is finally asked: can men restrain their appetite for revenge in order to govern wisely? And this is sort of a telling thing, because the poem emphasizes Aeneas as a figure who is marked by what's called pietas. Pietas is a Roman virtue that means a sense of duty. And a sense of duty, duty to the gods. And then you owe duty to your family after you've dealt with those. So if helping Rome out means hurting your family, you're going to help Rome out and hurt your family. I think the Romans would say that never is going to hurt the gods, so they wouldn't see that as a conflict. Throughout, Aeneas marks himself as a man of pietas, a man with a sense of duty. Ends with him killing Turnus. Turnus' ghost goes screaming to the underworld, and the poem ends. The poem ends on a very dramatic point, right? So there's no resolution. It just sort of ends suddenly. And I think humans are capable of strong emotions like anger. And even though Aeneas is quite level-headed through, basically loses it in the last moment. So that could happen to anyone. And so there is this cautionary element in the work. So the selections we get from Virgil's Aeneid, we get 2 selections. We get a selection from Book 11, and this is only got 12 books, 12 chapters. But here we've got Aeneas mourning a young prince named Pallas, who came along with Aeneas from his father Evander, who's a Greek ruler in Italy, who's aiding the Trojans against the Italians that they're fighting. Pallas is a young man. He's never been in a war before. He is sent basically with Aeneas the art of war. He is killed by the Rutulian leader, the leader of the opposition, Turnus. And Turnus takes his war because Turnus is a big guy. He's younger, he's a teenager. The war belt doesn't really fit him, so he basically has it slung over his shoulder. And then we have a selection from Book 12, where Aeneas and Turnus meet in battle. Aeneas defeats Turnus. Turnus asks to be spared. How to spare him when he sees the war belt of Pallas, and then he abruptly gets angry and then just runs Turnus through, and Turnus' ghost goes screaming off to the underworld. End of poem. Very shocking ending and very sudden. So the reception part, the Nachleben here, looks at poems and World War II, and also from Northern Ireland, that deal with some artwork done in the 19th and 20th century that shows Achilles. So here we've got this statue, a marble statue, which is an island off the coast of Greece, which is on the Achilleon. There's like a little shrine to Achilles. It was set up actually the Empress of Austria to commemorate her dead son. So she basically, I guess her son loved the Iliad or something, and she decides to build this little shrine to Achilles on the island of Corfu. And there's this statue here of the dying Achilles, wounded, and it looks like he's pointing to his ankle. By the way, the bit about the heel, Achilles' heel, Homer doesn't know anything about that. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles, he does not want Patroclus. He wants to, but he decides not to because he doesn't have any armor. So he has to wait for armor. The other Greeks save the body of Patroclus from being captured by the Trojans. But he does not go into battle till the next day when he gets armor from Hephaestus, the blacksmith god. So that seems to me to say there isn't anything about him invulnerable, because if he was really invulnerable, he wouldn't be afraid about going out naked into battle. So the estate where it was located, the Achilleon, was used by the military in both World War I and World War II. It would have been used by the German military probably because Greece was under German control in World War II. World War I, I'm not sure. That would be upper and middle class soldiers of war story of Achilles. And many used his experiences, right? They would have read the Iliad in school, officers, prep schools, and so they would have read the Iliad in Greek. Many used his experiences as a touchstone to make sense of their own experiences of war. Patrick Shaw Stewart wrote Stand in the Trench, Achilles, a poem which questions the purpose of war rather than looking forward to its glory. So in World War I, because of the nature of that war, it was how mechanical it was, the old type of glory was no longer possible, and so these authors in World War I are often being quite critical of war and the image of the glory of war. Achilles Triumphant was commissioned to replace an earlier statue with a more martial Achilles. This statue of Achilles triumphant, as opposed to the one who's wounded and dying. The American poet Randall Jarrell, who mainly wrote about World War II, imagines the difference between modern warfare, the emotions it generates, and the emotions the Greeks felt at the death of Achilles. So for Jarrell, who was a bomber, he worked as a bomber pilot, from a bomb site, it's just a grid on the ground. You don't see the people, and so you don't see who you're actually killing. And so that changes a lot less emotional. And you've got a sword, they've got a sword, and you're fighting. That's up close and personal, but that was not his experience of war. An Irish poet, Michael Longley, used Achilles to reflect on the Irish Troubles, which are what happened in Ireland in the 60s and 70s, Northern Ireland, the sort of fight between the Protestants and the Catholics, and the way that war shapes one's identity. Right, but in Northern Ireland during that time period, you were either side or the other, right? So that determines sort of who you are, and there's not a whole lot of getting past that. Although when I was in graduate school at the University of Illinois, two fellow graduate students in the classics department were both from Northern Ireland. One was a Catholic, and the other one was a Protestant, and they get along great in Ireland, and both of them. But back home, when Catholic friends and the other one was with his Protestant friends, my guess is they probably reverted to a more hostile, suspicious view of the other than they showed us at the University of Illinois. Achilles remains useful as a method of understanding the experience of soldiers even in modern wars, and there is a book that's mentioned in the chapter in this section called Achilles in Vietnam. It's by Dr. Jonathan Shea, who is a psychologist. He's a psychiatrist who works at Mass General in Boston. He's also a professor of psychiatry at Harvard, and he oversaw patients suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome from the Vietnam War, meet in groups, and he was good friends with a Harvard classics professor, Gregory Nagy, who is an expert on Homer, and he decided what he was going to do is he was going to have the group read the Iliad, and they were going to use the talk about war, because things are different in some ways. The up close and personal thing is one thing, and the fact that you've got comrades who stay with you through the whole war, those were things that the fighters in Vietnam didn't have. You were there for 1 year. If you got through the 1 year, you basically got released. And change of people, there was less cohesion. And war was much more violent. The ways much more varied in Vietnam, but in the way the gods act reminded the Vietnam vets a lot of their commanders, because the commanders are basically planning strategy, like hotels far away from the action. They're not actually on the front line, but they're planning the fates of these men, just like the gods don't seem to care which you. And so it's an interesting book. I mean, I do recommend it. It's very well written. It's written for the layperson, not for an expert. So we're done with chapter 10, which a good chapter. It's a lot of fun. It's got a lot of interesting stuff in it.